Yep, so we're recording this now, so I'll just start with a bit of an introduction before I pass over to Neil, who really is the start of the show. So hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this lovely Tuesday evening in London, but given the international audience, all different times that you're joining us, so thanks for signing on. I'm Julia Lambeth. I am at the WSET School in London. We're not obviously hosting tastings at the moment due to the current situation, so we are now running a series of webinars, events, quizzes that we are using to do the job instead. So while we can't do the actual tasting part, we've got a great series of different events coming up that you'll hopefully find interesting and still gain something from, even if we don't have as much wine as we normally would. So tonight's theme, as you will know, is looking at Prosecco, and with us we've got Neil Phillips, who is the UK ambassador for Prosecco DOC, who's going to take us through all the different things you need to know about Prosecco, essentially. Neil's done tastings with us before. Some of you, I think, have done tastings with him too. Neil is, I think, uniquely placed in the wine world to answer not only your questions about wine, but also about horse racing. So if you've got any of those, you can type those in as well. I'm going to ask you to stay on mute through the presentation. If you do have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on them. And then at the end, we'll see how we're going for time. We can always have some more questions there too. So that's enough for me. I'm going to pass over to Neil now and we'll get started.
Thanks very much, Julia. Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much. And I know it's different time periods of the day for some of you, but thanks so much for joining us. We're nearly up to 200 here. So, as Julia said, I'm Neil Phillips, the wine tipster. I'm the UK ambassador for Prosecco DOC Consortium. We're delighted to have so many of you with us from so many different countries as well, and so many Prosecco fans, and great to see everybody actually just raising their glasses and enjoying a glass of Prosecco. What I'm going to do is, look, we're going to get loads and loads of questions. I want to keep it lots of info. Let's have some fun as well. And also, just to give you a bit of background as we go through the presentation about where Prosecco is produced, the grape varieties involved, what we're actually doing from an organic point of view, sustainable, but also in terms of how Prosecco is made. How is that different to champagne, for example, in terms of production for most of the Proseccos? And also as well, just to talk to you importantly about the differences, because this question pops up loads and loads of times as well, about brut, extra dry. What are the differences there? And also some of the new things that are happening as well. We will be at some stage introducing Prosecco Rosé, so I want to talk to you about that because I think that's going to be a very important development for us. And also as well to talk about some of the extra dry styles that are going to be introduced too in terms of Prosecco. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey with Prosecco. And Julia, we can just go on to the first slide as well, please.
Yeah.
Just put them through there. So I know we've got some folks here from Verona. We've had somebody signing on from Piedmont. So just to sort of take you right back a bit of history, folks, quite snappy here. But really in terms of the first, you're going right in terms of wine production, 1st century AD in the Prosecco area. And also first mention of the wine name Prosecco. That probably surprises you because if you think about in terms of the rise of Prosecco sales, if you even went back in the UK, say, for example, to 2008, we've had tremendous growth since then. We can go way, way back there in terms of the first mention. And also talking about the city of Prosecco in Trieste, so right in the eastern part of the whole Prosecco land there. And the mention of production of Prosecco. I know somebody came on earlier from Friuli, so hello to the guy from Friuli as well. We're talking about Friuli, Venezia, Giulia and Veneto today, ladies and gentlemen, not just talking about one region, but also about the method. I'm going to come on a bit later about the method, about how do we get the bubbles with Prosecco versus how we get the bubbles with champagne, for example, and other sparkling wines from around the globe. Sparkling wines in the States, for example. We've got lots of people from the States, but also, say, for example, versus Cava as well. I saw someone signing on from Barcelona, for example. But there was a lot of work done in the 1850s in terms of this second fermentation method about getting the bubbles. And there's a fantastic oenological school in Colignano, which is in the most important province of Treviso. And when we get a chance, to actually start traveling again. A couple were talking about going back to their place in Verona. What I'd also say is make sure you take the chance to go to the Enological School in Colignano. It's a great experience. They've had 6,000 students graduating from there. And then in 1970, we actually had a geographical typicity introduced in terms of the Prosecco wine and the name there. So things were developing there in terms of 1970. We'll just move on to the next slide, please, Julia. Then we'll just give you a little bit more of a pretty speedy history here, if we can just get when we get to that. Now, important point, ladies and gentlemen, is actually getting to 2009. So I represent the DOC area, which is what you can see in terms of the 9 provinces on the slide there. But there's also DOCG as well, and that is solely within the province of Treviso. And what happened was that DOCG used to be DOC, in fact, until 2009. And then, because of all the history related to Prosecco being produced in the northeast of Italy, people wanted to take some ownership on this. And that's when there was actually decreed you could recognise the Prosecco DOC areas, the 2 regions I just talked about in terms of Veneto and Friuli-Venezia Giulia. And that meant that DOC, which was in Treviso, in Corigliano and Valdo Biagne, was elevated to DOCG to become the 44th DOCG in Italy. So you can actually just see there, stretching across from the west, right across to the east, so you're in Trieste, where the city of Prosecco is about 270k. So brilliant journey when we get the opportunity to do that. But importantly as well, Treviso, as I said, is the main province. We do have the 2 regions, Veneto, which covers 5 provinces, and then Friuli-Venezia Giulia. We don't talk enough about Friuli-Venezia Giulia, in actual fact, as an important Prosecco region for Prosecco DOC. And for example, you're looking at Udine there, Pordenone, for example, where I think there are some really fantastic Prosecco producers, and I'll come on to them a bit later. And also, you're then stretching right out through Gorizia, out to Trieste. In reality, where the city of Prosecco is, there isn't that much Prosecco production. So the main 65-70% is in Veneto, so Belluno, Treviso, Venice, Padova, and Vicenza, those particular regions there. So one of the important things to say is we used to everybody talk about Prosecco the grape variety, but as of 2009, we had a definite area for Prosecco production, so we had to say, go back and use the original name for the Prosecco grape variety, Glera. So when I'm holding up a bottle of Prosecco like I'm holding up now, hope you can see that fine, this Biancavina, which I'm going to taste in a few minutes. Before 2009, I would have been talking about Prosecco, the style of sparkling wine. As of that date in July 2009, I'm now talking about Prosecco, the place. And the main grape variety for Prosecco is Glera, spelled Glera. Really important to remember that, folks. Whatever you're doing, whether you're doing it WSET, you're going to start doing WSET, is the key grape variety. So we're going to talk a lot about Glera tonight, and it's important to know about that. And I'm going to talk about the other varieties in a minute. But I actually think it's time to actually taste some wine again. So you started tasting at 6 o'clock. What I've got here, and a key thing here as well, is about the producers. Because the way it works with the Prosecco DOC Consortium, we plan all our activities for the year. We send out a note to all the participating producers to see which tastings they'd like to get involved in. And I usually end up presenting about 30 different producers over all the pieces I'm doing over a year. Now, this producer here is Biancavina. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of Biancavina. Maybe you can say something in the chat on that. Very, very good producer, started in 2004. They're, interestingly enough, just on the border of DOC and DOCG. They're in Treviso. This is a brut style. And actually, one of the things to say, and this is something that does create a bit of confusion, is the driest style of Prosecco is brut. Then you go extra dry, then you go dry. So this is a dry style, so it has up to 12 grams of sugar per litre. And I'm just going to pick this up because I'm just going to give this, as we would do on the Wine and Spirit Education Trust course, of course, it's actually look at the appearance. It's bright, looks nice and fresh. One of the things to say, this is 100% Glera. a lot of Proseccos are 100% Glera, but we're going to talk about a few a bit later, which are you're allowed to have up to 15% of other grape varieties in the blend. And we will be talking about Pinot Noir a bit later, Pinot Noir. So when I smell this is a big 2019 fruits. And what you want to get here with some Proseccos, you get more white flowers. This is very much about green apples to me. Some of them are much more appley. Interesting enough with this Prosecco as well, and when I come on to the Sharma method, is in terms of the whole fermentation process, this actually has 60 days on the lees. The minimum we have to do is 30 in actual fact. But this has 60 days, and there's quite a fashion now in Prosecco land in terms of producers wanting to do a bit more lees aging, because that bit of extra contact with the lees gives you a bit more text and more complexity. Folks, I'm going to say cheers to everybody around the world in all the different countries. Raise your glasses. Some of you, I like the pairing. I should have had here some Grana Padano cheese, actually, because I love Grana Padano. I don't know who actually enjoys Grana Padano. I love it. And that sort of creaminess of Grana Padano paired with this Prosecco would be brilliant. I'm just going to have a little taste. Well, that's lovely. This is, importantly, a lot of you will be buying some own-label Proseccos. There are some very good own-label Proseccos out there. We had the couple on earlier, buying local, so important right now, of course, or people ordering online as well. And this Bianchivina Prosecco DOC Brut actually is in the UK, the agent is Armit Wines, A-R-M-I-T. We've got a slide coming on a bit later, which will give you a list of all where you can buy the Proseccos from, and you can pick that up afterwards as well. And very good online company. I ought to say as well, very good company for other Italian wines, for sure. But I think this is a class act. I think it's got all that kind of freshness you want. But what it does have, and this is when we spend a bit more time when we're tasting Prosecco, is great length of finish as well. So for those of you who've done your WSET, we always talk about length of finish. So, really, really elegant, that sort of green apple characters coming through as well. And importantly, I talked about style here. This is a brut, so it's got about 10 grams of sugar. Another important thing we don't really talk enough about for me with Prosecco is acidity, which you get on the sides here, folks. And this wine has got really good acidity for me, and I like that. Good for pairing with Grana Padano I talked about in terms of the cheese, wonderful, wonderful cheese. But also, if you were having with seafood, for example, I think it makes a great pairing with that. And look, folks, lots of us are getting takeaways right now as well. Let's not forget about that. We're supporting locally. Where I live here in the Cotswolds, we've got a fantastic pizza company near us, so I've been enjoying Proseccos with pizzas as well. I'm very happy to... I don't know what we want to do here, Julie, whether we want to be taking any questions as we go along, or we're going to roll with that, or I'll just keep going. What would you like to do? So I'm just going to have a little taste of this.
I think there's a couple of questions just for what you're drinking, but fortunately other people in the group have been able to answer that. Well, there was one question about when the first time second fermentation was used in Prosecco. I don't know if you were going to cover that later.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that. So we're actually going to go, you're going to go right back in terms of it, stepping back to the 1870s. Is an actual 1895 in actual fact on that in terms of Prosecco, but really in terms of Prosecco you can really see quite a change if you go right back to 1930, for example, and a lot more recognition of sparkling wines. Clearly the big leap forward for Prosecco has been really over the last 15 years in terms of increase in production. I'll come on to that as well, so I'll come back and address that question.
Fab.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And that's just, we're going to pick this up afterwards, ladies and gentlemen. You've got a list of the wines you've had there. First one I've just shown there is Prosecco DOC Brut Treviso Bianchivina, available from armitwines.co.uk. As I said, really good online company. Also very good as well because they do have some fantastic other wines from Italy as well. I've got to emphasise that. Renowned for being a real specialist there. I am going to taste also I'm not going to taste all 8 of these. I know everyone will get very envious if I started tasting all 8 and you'll be thinking, hold on a minute, there's some questions we've got here, we need some answers. So I'm going to taste 3 wines. So I'm going to taste the Villa Sandi Il Fresco Organic Brut because I want talk a lot about organic tonight. And I want to talk about Astoria because I think they're a very, very good example of a very innovative Prosecco producer. The other 5 Proseccos listed there, I'm going to come back and talk to them about them as well, because one of the things I said earlier is, we have a lot of own label, which is great. In the UK here, we have some very good own label Proseccos in our retailers. But also, it's trying to get some recognition of specific producers that you'll be saying, well, that's a style of Prosecco I really love. And you'll notice, for example, you'll see the list of the stock. But what you'll notice is against Riccardo, the Prosecco second from bottom there, that they don't actually have an importer in the UK as yet. So one of the reasons they get involved in all the tasting is that they really hope that they can actually find a producer, that a company will want to start importing their wines in due course. And we had that a couple of years ago with another producer, and they found a UK agent. So that was brilliant news. But we do have a mixture of cooperatives here. Companies have been going for a long period of time, mixed up with some very new companies as well. So it's a real spread of family businesses, big cooperatives, very, very good cooperatives, and certainly some businesses that have started more recently as well. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Julia.
Just a couple of questions that come up. Firstly, Tony asks if are there any UK owned labels that you'd recommend?
I certainly think that Marks and Spencer's have done a very good job. They have used to use a producer called Mazzattini, and Mazzattini would be a producer I often feature in lots of sessions. In actual fact, they wanted to be in this session as well. That's a very, very good producer. And I'd also say, just as a note on Mazzattini, you can get Mazzattini through Berry Brothers and Rudd, another really impressive online company, very successful traditional wine merchant. But I love the way they've embraced everything new that's been happening in wine as well. And Mazzattini wines are available through there. I do actually think the San Leo, which is in Waitrose, is very good as well. And I'm going to come on and talk about Aldi in a bit as well to give some spread there. But also I'd add too, just while we're on stockists, I would love to see more other independents who are doing very well. Many of them at the moment in terms of online sales, which is fantastic news. It's been brilliant to see how well they're doing. But also I'd love to see independents listing more Proseccos. I think it'd be really good. It also encourages sales. People come and say, well, I want to buy other wines as well. So any other questions at this stage, Julia?
The other one was on the prevalence of non-vintage versus vintage.
Yeah, good question. I like that question. You'll just notice right down there with Riccardo, that's the only one that does have a vintage. It's usually we end up having what is called a Melissamato, so a vintage Prosecco. So all the fruit will come from that year, as you can see with Riccardo there with the 2019. Melissamatos make up about 20% of production, and it's up to the producer if they want to state and have effectively a vintage year. It's a bit like you're saying in champagne, where most champagnes, as you know, are multi-vintage. But what you can do in a good year is obviously make some vintage champagne. And it's very much up to the producers to do that. But do look out, you'll see on the back of the label mainly, where it will show you when, in actual fact, with this Riccardo, I'm not sure this is going to show up that well on the camera, to be honest, but on the back here it actually states the vintage. But interestingly enough, on the front label, it actually doesn't have the vintage on there. So it's something to look out for. It's usually when a producer is very pleased with that particular year. I mean, I will come to talk about years in a short while. What you are allowed to do as well is blend across a couple of years. So each year, like you do in champagne, you are allowed to keep some reserve wines back to blend in. We never quite know what the next year is going to be like in terms of variability of climate conditions. 2018 was a really amazing year in Prosecco land. 2019 was more challenging, but I think we've got some really good wines out of that. But you do get some years, yes, and better than others. So to have that advantage of keeping some wines back to blend across years is very important. What I would say is there are probably some wines here that may have a bit of a blend of the previous vintage in as well. That hence the fact they're non-vintage. Okay.
A couple more if you're happy.
Any more questions at this stage?
Yeah. A couple more. Yeah. They come in thick and fast now. Okay. So Pollyanna's asked whether Prosecco is the largest DOC in Italy.
That's a really good question. Actually, that's a great question, which I don't know the answer to. I think we're a pretty big DOC and we've grown a lot. I mean, we are now about 24,500 hectares in terms of vineyards. We are only allowed to plant a certain amount each year, as decreed by the Ministry of Agriculture. But clearly, as a DOC, we've made rapid progress in terms of new plantings there. Really good question. What I can do is I'll pick up on that one afterwards as well. Okay. Any others at this stage?
Yeah, there's a question from Salvatore about Prosecco Superiore di Cartizze, but I think you're going to talk about that later.
Yeah, I'll come on to Cartizze later, if that's okay.
And another one about what does special cuvée mean?
Well, I think in terms of that's when you're looking at sort of what you feel is a sort of special blend across your vineyards, really. Some people will have take one fruit from one particular vineyard in actual fact. And I will talk about that a bit later because there actually is a Rive system in place now in terms of DOCG, which I'll come on to a bit later on. But it's really just doing, with Melissa Marto, you're really wanting to take your best fruits and also your best your best vineyards to blend across from Melissa Marto, basically. Okay, let's move on, I think. Okay, folks, for those of you, couple in Verona, for those of you who haven't been to Prosecco Land, please go when we get a chance to come back. Life comes back to normal. I'm still surprised, actually, amazingly, how popular this part, in terms of this part of Italy is for. Clearly, we've had a massive success with Prosecco, but there are so many great places to go and visit in this part of Italy, and to embrace it all, really, by visiting producers who are great, and I will come on to wine tourism in a bit. But also, the fact is, just so many, obviously Venice, but I think Treviso is I think it's a brilliant, brilliant place to go and use as a base when you're in Prosecco. It's a beautiful city to walk around. Little Venice, as they call it. It's about 25k from Venice. So make sure you take a visit when we get the shot. The scenery is absolutely stunning. So can't say enough of great stuff about it. Dolomites there. And let's have the next slide because that will just get everybody going. Venice. I'd love to hear a big shout out for everybody who's been to Venice here because it's how fantastic is Venice, but I think it's just got so much to offer. And, I just love, hello to everybody from Italy, because I just love working with you. I love working with all the producers, and you've just got a great country. And this is, it's been so difficult for you, but I think it's just, we look forward to coming back, basically. Okay, let's roll on from Venice. Never thought I'd say that, to be honest, but anyway. So we're going now. I talked about Glera. So under the laws here in terms of Prosecco, we have to have 85% Glera in the blend. Now, I don't know how many of you would have actually heard about Glera before. Some of you would have heard that, obviously, with your WSET exams. But some of you were saying, I didn't really know much about this grape variety. And that's fair enough, because it's not a grape variety in terms of like Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay, which is planted in lots and lots of different areas around the world. It is found, obviously, it's northeast of Italy, but it's also found in Australia, for example, where they do actually produce some Prosecco. But it's something I will come on to a little bit later. But you'll see that in Proseccos, we have the Bianchivina, 100% Glera. Pretty much, as I said, the majority of Proseccos are 100% Glera, but you can use some other great varieties here. Vitiso, Pereira, for example, they're Bianchetta, Treviana, they're all indigenous grape varieties, Glera Lunga as well. Chardonnay, that grape variety we know lots about, a fantastic grape variety. I hope nobody's a member of the ABC Club, the Anything But Chardonnay Club, because there are great Chardonnays from around the world. But interesting enough, Chardonnay is used very little in the production of Prosecco. You've got the odd producer who might put in about 2 or 3% there. But, the main thing is here for me there's a choice of indigenous grape varieties. You see there at the bottom of the maximum 15%, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir is something I want to talk about specifically a bit later when I'm going to talk about Prosecco Rosé, because in terms of the production of Prosecco Rosé, when that starts, I hope with the 2020 vintage, clearly we're going to get the colour, the skin colour from Pinot Noir. There's a producer called Zonin. I don't know if anybody's tried Zonin. Very good, somebody nodding, I'm just seeing a nod there. Really good family business in Italy. Again, actually producing some fantastic wines around Italy. They produce a Prosecco, which is 85% Glera and 15% Pinot Nero. And it's quite interesting because you do taste a bit more weight of flavour and fruit coming through there with that 15% Pinot Nero, with that Zonin wine. Very interesting producer, good people to look out for. I think they do a really good Prosecco DOC Brut, but you can also track down their DOC Pinot Nero blend as well, which has 15% Pinot Nero, as I said. So that's a great variety. I'm going to a bit later on as well, because I'm sure somebody's going to ask me about this, talk about Calfondo as a style of Prosecco. And I will talk to you about Vadiso when I come on to that as well. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Julia. Well, I think it's going to be time to have the next Prosecco, actually. I'm just a lot of things here. Organic, because a big thing for us is in terms of new vineyard plantings. As I said, we are allowed by the Ministry of Agriculture to plant a certain number of hectares each year, but the whole drive now is about sustainability. It's about biodiversity. It's about organic in terms of not using pesticides, fungicides in the vineyards. And any new producer, any new vineyards, I should say, in terms of Prosecco, have to follow this code. They have to do that in terms of sustainability. That means when you're planting in vineyards, you need to plant hedges as well. You've got to attract floral life. You've got to attract bird life as well. And there's a massive piece actually which is available from our Prosecco DOC consortium to any producer saying this is all the detail, these are all the points that are actually going to help you in applying and saying I would like to actually expand my vineyards. I'm going to follow in terms of organic, sustainable biodiversity as well. Now this producer here is, I hope we can see this okay, I'm just holding up, I'm not sure. This is a producer called Villa Sandy. Now, I can see some people trying to just look at the label. They have a sister-brother brand called La Gioiosa, Gioiosa. Some of you, if you go into Majestic here in the UK, and actually I'm sure in the States as well for that matter, because the States is the second biggest export market for Prosecco, is you will see La Gioiosa in Majestic, you'll see it in Waitrose, for example, here in the UK, you'll see it in a lot of places. Villa Sandy, interestingly enough, is a wine very much for independence. So this can be bought in the UK from a very good company called North South Wines. Go to them online, for example. But the key thing about them is that they very much, the Villa Sandy label is for independence, online, and when we can come back to this piece, restaurants as well, hospitality. Now, this is an organic Prosecco. So as I said, no pesticides there. And Villa Sandy very much driven the whole biodiversity project, really. They're really one of the leaders in terms of producers about biodiversity. They're involved in lots of projects here about sustainability as well. They've done a lot of presenting on this and they've won a lot of awards for this too. I'd also say, just going back to the slide we went a few minutes ago in terms of the Dolomites and Venice, when you're out in Prosecco land, this is a producer I highly recommend you go and visit, Villa Sandy, because it's actually the company is owned by the Moretti Poligato family, and they are wonderful, charming family, lovely people to meet. But they have this beautiful it's a whole sort of palatial feel. There's great history of fantastic buildings there, and also as a recommendation for you is they have a wonderful B&B called Locanda Sandy, very informal. You can do, I think it's got 7 rooms on memory, and when traveling comes back for us, I highly recommend you go around Villa Sandy and all of that. If you love motorbikes, by the way, they've got a fantastic collection of motorbikes. And I don't know how many motorbike fans we've got here with us tonight. We've got 206 people online at the minute. I'm not sure how many motorbike fans there are, but if you are, you'd be really happy to have a look around there. But also because of what they're doing in terms of biodiversity and organic. And Lacandasandi is a very relaxed, chilled out place to stay. It's very informal, nice B&B. I'd also say it's got the most fantastic views from there as well. Any cyclists out there, in October, normally they have the Prosecco bike ride, ladies and gentlemen, 100k ride through the hilly lands of Prosecco lands. There's a few stops for a glass of Prosecco here and there. And a couple of years ago, we had two guys who did that ride on a tandem from England and cycled back from Treviso to Islington, carrying a magnum of Villasandi on the back of the bike, which we had the chance to taste. Now, this is 2019 fruit. It's Il Fresco. It's Brut. This is the organic. So this is quite a new one in terms of Villasandi. As opposed to the previous one, like the Biancaviglia, this is, A, it's 100% Glera, but B, for me, which is the interesting thing, is it's not so much the sort of green apples here. Always for me with Villasandi, it's much more floral notes to me, much more white flowers. And when I taste here, the organic style is just this wine, I've tasted so many Villasandi wines over the years, but this is a little bit fuller, a bit richer. This is, personal preference here. I think, again, in terms of sugar levels, you're probably about 9 grams here. So Brut goes from 0 to 12. And again, what I like here is the elegance. I also like the acidity. But for me as well, I'd be definitely thinking about having some food with this as well, because certainly some of these salads we're doing, just light salads, like a chicken salad, something like that, I think this is a great pairing for this. And also, again, coming back to seafood as well. And again, look, informally, folks, come on, I've ordered, we're ordering pizzas. We're just sitting down to have an informal family meal, and it's great to enjoy this Prosecco. But they have a very good reputation. They've won lots of awards. There's an award called the Glass of Bubbly Awards, and I've just been judging on that. And Villasandi won the overall wine a couple of years ago there. So, by the way, when you're judging for those awards, it's blind tasting, folks. So typically we taste about 75 sparkling wines in a day, blind, which some of you will be thinking, great, that is a fantastic job, Wine Tipster. We'd like to do that. I can see some people filling out some application forms here. And, but, the constant, what you've got to do when you judge, by the way, you need to give wine number one the same level of concentration as you do to wine 75. And let's remember that. So we'll probably taste about 50 wines, then have a break for a bit of light lunch and come back and keep concentrating. Now, I chair one of the groups on that, so there's always quite a lot of debate about marking each of the wines, but it's a great thing to do, and they've done so well with that. But I think that's a really impressive wine. There's no doubt as well, organic, vegan, sustainability, biodiversity. The world of wine is embracing that more, particularly in the old world, particularly in Europe, really, in terms of looking at organic. And interestingly enough, I wanted to say something just at the beginning, is I did my first wine and spirit education trust course in 1986. I had hair then, folks. I had a lot of hair. But that's when I got my higher certificate. And out of that, I got my first job in the drinks industry, thanks to the WSET. So I've also presented as an educator with the WSET, and I think it's a brilliant organisation. And it's changed too, because it used to be very, very sort of trade focused, and it's really about us punters. Julia's giving me the thumbs up there. Well, too right, Julia. I mean, it's global. But I think the thing is here, organic has been talked about for a long time, but I felt it didn't really actually have that much engagement, but it most definitely has now. Obviously, food and vegan has really risen up as well. And I'll come on to talk about vegan wines and how you distinguish those in terms of the findings a little bit later on. So big messages there. Very, very important for the Prosecco DOC consortium, very important for all of us. So you're going to see a lot more of that. And there's a whole group of producers now who are very, very engaged in all of this as well. So let's move on to the next slide, please. I don't know if we get any more questions, actually, Jim.
I was just about to say a couple of questions before we move on, if that's okay. A couple of people asking if you can tell them any particular producers that use Pinot Noir in their blend.
Certainly Zonin, and I think they're probably one of the main ones, really, because they've made a big noise in a way about saying, look, we're using 15. What they've done is actually they have a series where they have one grape variety making up 15% of the blend. And that's quite a lot. That's quite different to most people, because invariably you might be talking 5-6% if there's another grape variety in the blend. But they're probably the sort of foremost for me in terms of having really pushed out about 3 or 4 years ago with their Pinot Nero. So look out for Zonin. It's available in lots of countries. I mean, that's the thing to say as well. In terms of Pinot Nero, when I come to Prosecco Rosé, clearly Pinot Nero is going to has a big role to play there in terms of Prosecco Rosé, and we're going to be talking a lot more about Pinot Nero, Pinot Noir. Any more questions at this stage?
Yeah, one related to what you were saying about, in fact, a couple related to the kind of sustainability. The first one's a bit broader. Given that there is a focus on organic and sustainable production, is there any contradiction there with bigger brands trying to sort of cash in on the popularity of Prosecco? The example of Frugine was given.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there have been some bigger brands coming in, and they've certainly seen, in terms of the popularity of Prosecco, and there are some big producers out there. But that's true for lots of parts of the world of wine. You go to Australia, for example, and I worked on Jacob's Creek years ago. There's a big brand for you. I don't think they're cash. I think in terms of sustainability and organic, as I said, I think organic took a long time to get going with a lot of people, really. But I think now, with it's coupled with sustainability, the biodiversity, and the fact that we have so many more people who are vegan as well, that's been a massive rise, as we know. And I think all those elements together have really brought about a lot of changes and focus in wine. And I don't see it as a way of people capitalising on stuff in that way. I think it's just about going forwards in the right way, in the interest of everybody, really. And I think it's been very interesting to see the spread of producers who are engaged in all of this, because it's also much smaller producers who are engaged here. I can think of a producer, a lovely family called Pisolato. Pisolato wines that are available in the UK. All their wines are organic. All their wines are suitable for vegans. There's going to be more and more of that. And I think, it's great. Come on.
Cool. And the slightly less broad question was about organic certification bodies in Prosecco.
Yeah, now I think you're seeing the certification bodies there. That is a good question. There is still and it also applies to vegan as well, there are Proseccos out there which are vegan, but I have to say it is still, and you can talk to some importers in more general terms, not just about Prosecco here, is that they have wines in their portfolio which are suitable for vegans, but there's no certification on the bottle to tell you that. And we have to encourage people to get that certification more, because I was talking to a Prosecco producer actually last week on Friday. They're organic, they are vegan now, and for their next vintage, they will include vegan certification. We need to increase that all the time. We need more certification. They are there. People need to get those on those bottles as much as they can. It is very difficult. A wine importer is going to have something like 15, a big wine importer have 1,500 wines on their list. And it's a big job, in actual fact, realizing a lot more vegan wines out there. And every wine list should be telling us, obviously, about what is organic on the list, what is vegan. everything like that, really. So I'm hopeful that we are going to see a lot more developments on that. It's a good question. We need to keep informing everybody in terms of what is suitable in terms of vegan as well. Okay.
Cool. Shireen's question following on that is it expensive for some smaller producers, though, to get the certification?
Yeah, that is a point, and that is a point of, yeah, it is very much so. And I know, and I've been talking to a couple of importers. They're in charge of the whole portfolio for their list, which might be 1,500 wines in some cases, and actually going to producers and finding out that detail, and then realizing, well, actually, we've got a lot more vegan wines than we thought, but the cost does play a card there, that's for sure. We have to encourage producers to say, well, look, if you spend that bit of money, that is going to benefit you in terms of increased sales, for sure, I think. That's the information I think not only for currently, we obviously have what you can buy online, but what you can buy in independents. But when we have the time that we can actually resume going to restaurants, that important communication on the list. Part of actually bringing a bottle to a table as part of service will also be showing you about the certification as well. And I think that's really important. So I hope to see gradual, I'd like to see more change on that. I appreciate there's costs, small businesses and overhead, but I think it's an important one to be involved with and take that step forward, really. Any more, Julia, or should I talk a bit about production?
That's all on the ones so far. There's more I might bring up later if you don't cover them. Okay.
So, folks, important point here, because one thing is we're going to talk about this whole second fermentation in tank. Now, important point here is, when we're talking about champagne, we're talking about second fermentation in bottle. We're talking about second fermentation in bottle for cava, for example, as well. But with Prosecco, for pretty much 99.8% of Prosecco production, we're talking about second fermentation in tank. And we're also talking, importantly, about a much quicker process here in terms of going from the point when you're being in a vineyard, picking a grape, to actually drinking something like the next one I'm going to try, Astoria, for example. It's much quicker than cava, it's much quicker than champagne. But the reason for that is because Glera, which is this grape variety that dominates, as you know, it's a grape variety for most of us. We want to enjoy Proseccos when they're young, and we want to pick up those really good fruity notes. And importantly, I talked a bit earlier about acidity, and this is where the Charmat method, the Martinotti method, really helps here in retaining that sort of fruit character and retaining acidity. So you just look there. I'm not going to get too technical here, but I know we've got a broad, some of you you've done a lot of this before. I know with your WSET courses, some of you are coming in going, hey, I fancy doing a WSET course out. This would be great. Great present to someone, by the way. But you pick your grapes. By the way, if you haven't done a harvest, folks, and you want to do one, do it. Go and help out, pick the grapes, and you'll see, for example, it's hard work, but it's a very, very stressful time in a vineyard. Some years we've had crazy weather here in the UK with pretty much brilliant sunshine most of the time. You really want to have that during a harvest, for example. But sometimes you don't get that. And you've started picking, the grapes have got that ripeness, that sugar content you want. You have an actual date which you're allowed to start picking from. And that's decreed by the consortium, the Ministry of Agriculture. Some people will start right at the beginning. Some will actually pick at a slightly later date. But sometimes what will happen as well is you get rain, as we actually had a couple of years ago during a harvest. Do you carry on and pick, or do you decide to wait and hope you're going to get some good weather? Big gamble, stressful time. So you pick. Then what you want to do is, and you'll see this, a couple of years ago, I was actually out in Prosecco land. I was actually at Astoria, as it happens, one of the wines I'm going to come on to taste in a few minutes' time. And I was watching as the last grapes arrived from the 2018 harvest, going into the destemmer. And then you'll see on the screen there, pressing. And that's a very gentle pressing there. Remember, What you have with Glera, you're going to have that white juice inside the grape. So when you're just pressing, you're doing a very gentle pressing because you don't want to have too much skin contact there to press off that juice. And just remember as well, with Pinot Nero, Pinot Noir, that's a dark skin grape variety, but inside is white juice. So we'll talk a bit later about some skin contact there with that Pinot Nero when we're allowed to actually produce Prosecco Rosé. You've had that pressing, it goes into the tank there, in the way it would do with other sparkling wines, and starts its first fermentation. It's still a still wine. We haven't got any bubbles yet. So you've got your yeast and sugar working together. It will have, depending on the producer, a certain period for that primary fermentation there. One of the things that I did in 2018, I went to a producer called Antonio Fachin, and I tasted, they always have a lunch after they've picked the harvest for a couple of local charities, and I tasted juice from 2018, which was a brilliant, brilliant Prosecco year. Everything worked. The sun was out. It was great. We've got fantastic, but brilliant high-quality wines in 2018, was tasting juice from that first tank. You can actually see there. I'll never forget what that juice tasted like. It was absolutely amazing. And sometimes you talk about your great wine moments, folks. It's not about always having a wonderful celebration. It's about being somewhere with lots of great people while they were having a big family day and tasting from that. It was brilliant. Now, here's the important piece. You've done your first fermentation. The second fermentation, if I was making some champagne, what I would be doing would be, I'm just going to pick up a different bottle here to give another producer a bit of a shout out on camera. So this is Ponti, by the way. Very good cooperative. And I'll come on to talk about them a bit later. But let's imagine I was going through the champagne process. I would have gone through that first fermentation. I've got my Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier separate, being fermented separately by village, for example. I would then blend, add some older wines. Remember, it's a multi-vintage wine in terms of most champagnes. You would then add some sugar and yeast. And what you would do is put a cap on the top of the bottle. It would go in the cellar. It would be like that. It would start a second fermentation because the sugar and the yeast are going to go out together. They're going to create that CO2. That's how you get your bubbles. And that's the important point, is that once it's finished that fermentation, it's going to rest on the dead yeast, the lees, and it's going to actually, it helps by having that contact as well. And what will happen is it gets a bit more complexity. Depending on the champagne house, they will leave it for a certain period of time. They have to leave it for 15 months for non-vintage, 3 years for vintage, but many houses will do for longer. And what they do over time is get the yeast down to the neck of the bottle here. And they used to have what they call riddlers, who would just gently turn a bottle and get the yeast down to the neck. And they can do 40,000 bottles a day. You'll see that's still a bit in champagne now. But once it comes out the cellar, they will freeze this top part of the champagne bottle, flick off the crown cap. Then what will happen is a block of ice, they've frozen that top bit, will come out. That's your dead yeast, which you've got down to the neck of the bottle. And then what you've done there as well is you've just lost a little drop of wine there. You top it up with some sugar, you top up that 1% of wine, and then you label. Now, you'll notice going back to the screen, that's all done in tank. That's all done with second fermentation. You control the pressure. The minimum time by law for second fermentation, I don't want to get into too much detail, but this is important to know because is 30 days. So Astoria, where I was at in 2018, they always want to have super youthful, fresh Proseccos. And what they will do is ferment for about 25 days, leave on the dead yeast for about 5 days. And then what they will do then is actually separate the yeast. They'll actually then draw the wine away, either take out the yeast. They'll also fine the wine as well. So that's any little tiny particles. Because when you see a glass of Prosecco, for example, you're looking at something that's fresh and bright and you haven't got any particles there. What you will do is actually fine the wine. Now, traditionally, we've used egg whites to fine wines. Obviously, from a vegan perspective, that's not going to work. So you can actually have some clay powder you use now, which a lot of the Prosecco producers are doing. Comes back to that certification point as well. And they will use that to fine the wine, bentonite. So that means that wine is suitable for vegans. It clears the wine. Then what you're going to do is is you've got the wine either drawn off into another tank or staying in that tank, having been the yeast being taken away and also being fined, and then you simply add your sugar. Now, the point here is in terms of sugar, for brut, and I'll come on to another chart in a minute, but it's going to be 0 to 12 grams of brut, for example, then you go extra dry. Importantly, what is happening a bit in Prosecco, I talked about Biancavinia. You know, they like to leave their wine on the lees for longer, 60 days. Some producers are now doing 90 days because they quite like to have that bit of lees contact. Slightly different style of Prosecco. And we're seeing quite a trend for that now as well. Then obviously what you're going to do is, after that period of time, for 2019, some producers were actually bottling in December 2019. We can't do that for champagne. We can't do that for cava. It's a longer period of aging. But the key thing is here, folks, we want to get the freshness. We want to get the acidity. And that youthfulness is very important. And the Sharma method, the Martinotti method, this method here with actually creating the bubbles with the sugar and yeast in tank really works for Glera. It really does. And that's why we want to use this. So that certainly it does save on cost, but it's more about the style of the wine here. So that's when you will see wines being released later on. So you could actually, I've been in Prosecco land before now, drinking in December bottled Prosecco, which would have been harvested in September, maybe stretching to a little bit of October. So, you know, there are other people doing some different things. Let's move on to the next slide, please.
Actually, got a few questions.
Oh, I've probably got loads of questions on this one. So, yeah.
Lots of questions going through. Is there any particular type of press that's used for the gentle pressing that you mentioned? And also, is there anything to do with exposure to oxygen to limit that in any way?
I mean, I think in terms of presses, I think there's no one particular press, but having been there and been there at harvest time, seeing, for example, Astoria, we obviously have to do a really gentle pressing here because we want to get all that fruit carry. We don't have that too much skin contact there. And it's it's a very impressive, quick process, really, in terms of watching that, in terms of getting into tank as quickly as possible.
A couple of people asking about yeast strains. Are there any particular yeast strains? Is it mostly commercial or indigenous?
It's it'd be a combination of some commercial, some indigenous. Again, there are producers doing a lot of there's a lot of experimentation going on, you know, because we've talked about what's happening in the vineyards. We've talked about aging as well, but also in terms of yeast strains as well. So there's a combination there as well, again, depending on producer. And it's, you know, some of the small producers are doing some very interesting things there. But again, you can go to some of the bigger producers. I mean, Villa Sandy is a pretty big producer, but they're doing a lot of innovation there and a lot of aging and looking at yeast strains, for example.
Well, speaking of experimentation, and that brings us nicely onto another question, excuse me, about whether anyone's doing any fermentation in cask.
Not that I'm aware. I think that's a really... I've seen some cement. I've seen rather than tank. I've actually been somewhere where they're using cement in terms of fermentation, which is a bit of a step back to the older days there. I haven't seen anybody using any cask. What I would say as well is that you obviously have a very small amount of Prosecco being produced with second fermentation in bottle. So they call it a style called Colfondo, Colfondo. And if you look at total production in Prosecco DOC, it's about 0.2%. But you will go to some restaurants, folks, and you'll go to some independents and see Colfondo on the shelves. Now, the thing to say about that is, one of the things is it has a lot of skin contact. So the colour of that Prosecco can look, you know, with that skin contact can look quite sort of orange. And also some of the grape varieties I mentioned earlier, like Vadiso, is a grape variety that people like to use in Colfondo, for example. The other thing is, when I mentioned champagne, I talked about getting the yeast, the dead lees, down to the neck of the bottle. With Colfondos, with Prosecco, you will end up still having the yeast in the bottle. So whenever you get a chance, if you're going, you're buying from independents, what you will see in that clear bottle is there's a producer called Casa Belfi, for example. They have a very good Colfondo. You will actually you see the yeast floating around at the bottom of the bottle. So obviously when you first get it, you're about to drink it, don't actually just start shaking the bottle like crazy, folks, because you're going to have a lot of yeast floating about there. Generally speaking, you're going to get about 5 glasses there in terms of the Calfundo Prosecco. Very, very dry. Very, very dry indeed. Great with food. I think it's always been interesting to see there's some restaurants doing Calfundos now, but they need to do a Prosecco in a way like the Astoria, an extra dry as well. But there's a small amount of that going on at this current time. And I think the Calfundo production might increase a bit, but primarily it's about being in tank, really.
So that's, I think someone asked about styles of Prosecco where you'd have more of an obvious yeasty note. So I think Calfundo would really be the one to go for there.
I think Calfundo, but I'd also say as well, Jen, I think because you're seeing more producers now as well. I mean, I think it's really important we have producers like Astoria, and I'm going to taste some Astoria in a minute. But I think it's really important we have producers who are really going for the minimum aging, the 30 days, because a lot of us, the way we started with Prosecco was having extra dry, minimum aging, beautifully made, really good Prosecco. But we're a broader audience as well. And I think for some people, I talked about Biancavina, 60 days on lees. There's a producer called Piero Martelloso. They do 90 days in Friuli, interesting enough there. They are producing award-winning Proseccos, and that's 90 days on the lees. And that tastes quite different. There are a couple of producers out there as well where you will actually taste something that is not just a year old. I've actually kept some Proseccos back that are 3 or 4 years old now. And they're quite interesting to taste especially in terms of food pairing, because they just, as they get older, they just sort of get fuller in flavour, really. But they lose some of that those really nice, attractive, sort of real citrus notes. So I think you can start to look out for some producers with longer aging. Calfundos, yes, but there are other producers to go for as well.
They don't have any labelling terms to indicate sort of extended lees or yeast contact, though.
No, they don't. And I think that's one thing in terms of back label communication. I think I'd like, we're working on that to actually state that, because that's a question that's popping up more. And I think it's interesting as well that we've talked about extra dry. Extra dry has been about 75-80% of production, which is 13 to 18 grams of sugar per litre. So for a lot of us, and for me, my first Prosecco, and actually just going to taste this Astoria, was saying hello to a producer like Astoria, or it might have been saying hello to Ponti, which, by the way, when you see this wine around, I think this is a really good extra dry Prosecco. And certainly for me, if I have people coming around or, in the future, or I'm just going to be drinking something at home with the family, I think this is really well made too. And it's a great example of extra dry Prosecco, minimum aging like the Astoria as well. But the Astoria, this is 2019 fruit. They've always been Astoria, by the way, and I just come back on that point about the labelling. The Astoria has always been a company that wants to do minimum periods. It's 20 years old as a business. It's the Poligato family. It's not related to the Villasandi, Marisa Poligato family. Great place to go and visit. Beautiful place to go and visit. But I loved being there at harvest time, which was a stressful time in 2018 for any producer. And the fact they gave me time to walk around, taste from tank, just actually see what was going on, it was really great. And I think this captures for me what a lot of people are looking for with Prosecco and why it's popular, but also it captures, coming back to one of the other questions about well-made wines, and this is very well made for me. It has got the citrus floral character, but it's got real elegance and it's got real good length of finish, and it's ultra consistent, Astoria. I'm very impressed with them. So look out for them. It's a very distinctive bottle, which I'm sure you can see there. You can easily get this at Gerald Seal online. They, interestingly enough, are like Villasandi doing, as a lot of producers are, doing a lot of biodiversity work now as well. So they have they have an organic Prosecco. This is, as we were talking earlier on, this is a big thing that's happening. But I think this tastes great. So that's minimum, but I would, coming back to the lees aging, it would certainly be good to start seeing producers putting that on the back label. Bit more information. Our back labels have generally got better. over the years. I remember when back labels didn't used to tell you very much, folks, but they tell you a lot more now. And they, great to see a bit more about food pairing as well. And obviously seeing more certification coming through, which will happen. Let's move on to the next slide as well, because this is important in terms of something that's really, I think, important in terms of, again, about if we're going to have lees aging, but also the differences in terms of what Spumante, Frizzante, still, and also I've talked about brut, but I want to just talk about, we'll just taste an extra dry, in terms of styles. Now, Spumante, all the Proseccos I've got on the bar here, and I'm just going to change a couple around so we can actually see a couple more on camera here. Like this Melage Prosecco, for example, here, which is available online, folks. This is a Prosecco which is produced by La Marca, which is a big, big co-op, actually. Very, very important co-op. Lots of vineyard owners there, lots of members. I'm a big fan of co-ops, by the way. Co-ops are very important in regions in terms of wine production. The co-op in the UK is doing a great job right now. But this is an example of a Spumante. So you'll see there on the screen, 82% of Prosecco that's produced is Spumante. Now, the pressure, when you look at the bar there, it goes in three bars. Now, Champagne primarily is 6 bars, 6 atmospheres of pressure per bottle. In general terms, there are some about 4.5. Proseccos don't get up to 6 bars generally. So one of the other things, just in terms of bubbles, and I'll just pour some more Prosecco in here, is the mousse is quite, you do get that mousse, but it's really, the bubbles are very small, it's quite soft. But one of the things here is you're generally speaking, and you can control that pressure, by the way, with the second fermentation. Remember that, because you've got those pressurized tanks and that whole piece in terms of the sugar and yeast. But the thing is, Spumante is often about 4 to 5 bars of pressure, maybe 4.5. So that's 82% of production. Now, I'm interested to know if any of you out there are buying Frizzante Proseccos, because you'll see there you've got between 1 to 2.5 bars. And by the way, with the closure with Frizzante, what you will see is sometimes in screw cap, because it might only just be 1 bar. Or you will actually see the traditional style where you've got a cork here and a little sort of metal bar over. I'm just going to sort of show you this. Let's give another producer a bit of a shout out, Brugge. So let's say this was their Frizzante. Across the top here would be a little, you've got a cork, then you've got a little metal bar here. It's all done manually, folks. And I think Frizzantes are really interesting and still underrated in terms of the Prosecco experience. If you want something very gently sparkling, lovely aperitivo style, but actually just that time when you think, hey, I just want to have a really nice glass of wine. It's really, really good. And as you'll see, 17% is Frizzante. I think over time we may see a bit of a change on that. But a lot of us just like to have something gently sparkling as well. So, but it does give you the contrast here in terms of the gentleness. Now, at the top there, you'll see still. And I don't know if anybody here has actually tasted a Tranquillo, a still Prosecco. I'll be interested to know, maybe a couple of the Italians who are with us and some nodding heads here going, no, I've never tasted a Tranquillo Prosecco. There are a couple of people in the UK who have them. But in actual fact, what will mostly happen is when you're in Italy, for example, and you walk into a bar in Treviso or Venice, and you look at the back bar, there will be some Tranquillo. Try it. It's still, this company here, Riccardo, they actually produce a Tranquillo, which you can buy online. This is the producer, by the way, that doesn't have a UK agent as yet, but I'm hoping they will with all the sessions we'll be doing this year. Really good family business, by the way. They are big, by the way, on the whole biodiversity piece as well. But interesting enough, they produce a Tranquillo, which is quite unusual, as you can obviously see in terms of the stats there. I've tasted quite a few Tranquillos in my time. For anybody London-based, when we get the opportunity to get back out there, I think Borough Wines have a Tranquillo, for example. Somebody in Borough does that. So, but certainly check out Riccardo as well. So you've got Spumante, Frizzante, still. I talked about Cofondo as well. Just in the bottom part of the slide, really important piece, folks. Brut. So our current classification in terms of brut is 0 grams to 12 grams. I talked about the fact we had a Bianchi Vigna. We also had as well Villa Sandy, both about 10 grams. Extra dry, which we had with the Astoria, was about 14, 15 grams. As I said, extra dry has been pretty much 75%, 80% of production. Interesting enough, if you look at the 2019 vintage, and I just received that information this morning, you can actually see that we're about 30% brut now. So brut production is increasing a bit in Italy, in Prosecco land. We are looking to introduce a new extra brut category, which will be 0 to 6 grams of sugar. So that's going to be very dry. Some of you are really going to embrace that and go, that's going to be fantastic with food, really great fish dishes, also with some white meat dishes like chicken, for example, those sort of dishes. And some of you are going to really like that style. But extra dry, I think it's really important, by the way, to say with extra dry, it's the most popular style. It's a style which I think I talked about. Ponti, for example, I've talked about Melage. We've got Laruga here, all extra dries. And I think, one of the things for me is I think it's a great way to kick off. But some days I want to have an extra dry. Some days I want to have a brut. And, one of the questions earlier was about producers. And that's the thing in the way you look for other wine regions. Different producers, slightly different styles. You have different favourites across certain producers. But I think extra dry, one of the key things to me as well is don't get too hung up. You can see on the back label, by the way, it will tell you if it's brut, it will tell you if it's extra dry. Now, if I did a survey of 100 people, I'd probably say about 25% of us are looking to see if a Prosecco is brut or extra dry. So it's something you can easily see on the label there. And the other thing to say is as well that in terms of extra dry, don't get hung up about saying, I only drink brut, I only drink extra dry. Because my experience is with producers, I can think of a producer here like Melage, for example, with their extra dry. There's really good acidity with that. And I think if you gave people this wine in a blind tasting, I'm not sure people would recognise it extra dry, to be honest. It's more about actually looking at the producer for me and looking at the style of the wine that you really enjoy. I think that is the most important piece here. You'll notice also dry between 17 grams and 32 grams of sugar. Now, a question I can see somebody going, wow, that's interesting. But we had a question earlier about Cartizze. So you saw the map earlier on in terms of Prosecco DOC, what we're covering in terms of Veneto, Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, with the 9 provinces. Let's bring ourselves back to Treviso. We're going to travel up into the hills. And when I was talking about Villa Sandy earlier, interestingly enough, and I talked about Lacanda Sandy, this wonderful B&B to stay at, when you're there, and you're having a glass of Villa Sandy al Fresco organic brut, you're looking up the hills there, and you can actually see Cartizze. And whenever for me, as I said earlier, I end up sounding like the tourist board for the northeast of Italy, but I'm proud of it because it's such a beautiful place to go to. But if you get to the top of Cartizze, you have a beautiful view of Prosecco land. This is in the Val d'Orbiadene area. So there's Val d'Orbiadene and Colignano, which make up the DOCG Superiore area. And also you have another area called Asolo as well. But here with Cartizze is where you really find some exceptional dry Proseccos. One of the things is that it's a very difficult place in which to produce Prosecco. It's 107 hectares. We have about 24,500 hectares across the Prosecco DOC, about another 6,000 in Prosecco DOCG, and I'm talking to you about 107 hectares. Now in the UK, I don't know what that stat is in the States actually, out of the 400 bottles of Prosecco we purchase in the UK, every 400 bottles, one of those bottles only will be from Cartizze. So it's small production. It's very fragmented as people, you've got a brother owns 1 hectare or half a hectare, a sister owns the other half. It requires 7 times as much labour because it's so steep there as well. But they do produce some absolutely fantastic dry Proseccos that could have, say, 25, 26 grams of residual sugar in them. But they are beautiful, beautiful wines. When it's not quite right, it can be a bit saccharine. But Villa Sandy, for example, I know they do. I've been up there and they do a fantastic Cartizze Prosecco. It's a real treat. It's fantastic with some lighter desserts as well. And this is one of the things to say, is because you've got the Brut extra dry and dry. It is absolutely, if you just took a sort of lemon tart, something like that, it's brilliant. And the main thing to do really is just simply have some tiramisu, though, I have to say, and just enjoy, a whole range of Proseccos for that matter. Why not? Come on. I mean, tiramisu, that's where it comes from, folks. So let's embrace tiramisu. And I wish I had some here. I failed, I should have a grabadon, I should have had some nice seafood and some tiramisu as well. I could have stood there all night then. Demi-sec, very, very tiny production of demi-sec. And so the main focus of production is around extra dry and brut, but do take the chance at some point to try a dry Prosecco. There are actually some producers of Prosecco DOC that produce some dry Proseccos as well. So do look out for that. Remember, it's very easy to see on the label. It has to state if it's brut, extra dry or dry. And also it will state if it's a Melissa Martin, when I was talking about that single, wine that has definitely come from a single year. Okay, I think there's quite a few Proseccos, to be honest, that they're all, that story, I'm convinced, is all 2019 fruit, but it doesn't actually say Melissa Martin on the label. But I think it's a really, it just shows you the variety here we have. I think also important in terms of frizzanti as well. Take the chance to embrace some of those frizzantis as well, because I think there's some cracking frizzantis out there by lots of the producers I've been talking about today and other producers as well, who are doing a great job. And it's just a really nice occasion just to enjoy a very nice semi-sparkling wine there as well. Have we got any more questions, Julia?
I think we've answered most of them as we're going along at the minute. I don't want to rush you there,
Okay.
but we're slightly over time a little bit, so I think...
I thought, sorry everybody, I meant to keep to 1 hour. I have failed on time management here. I did actually think, I'm sure it must be 7 o'clock by now. I just want to, I'd just like to do, Julia, just 2 or 3, can we just do 2 or 3 minutes more and then... Is that okay? Yeah,
I think people want to know a little bit about the rosé and
the rosé Prosecco, yes.
Changes to the DOC or whatever it was that we mentioned earlier. Yes. So,
okay.
But yeah, I mean, people can go if they need to go.
One of the things, Prosecco Rosé. Look, folks, there's nothing on telly. Come on, stick with it.
Well, I think you're the best, so there's lots of endorsement here.
Thank you. But hey, look, folks, most importantly, thanks for tuning in, really, because it's great to have the opportunity. We really appreciate it. And as I said to you earlier, WSET has been very important to me. Get involved with the WSET. It's great, lovely people, but it's just a great way. And I've noticed over the years, just quickly, presenting at all the food festivals I present, so many more people come up to me and say, where can I find out a bit more about wine? They don't want to, and you just say, well, look, you're going to have a WSET, Wine Spirit Education Trust educator somewhere near you in the UK, folks. Now, Prosecco Rosé. There's definitely been quite a bit of confusion here, because if we had all of us standing in a great big tent and I'd asked you to all put your hands up and say, who thinks they've had a Prosecco Rosé, some of you would have put your hands up. And that's not because I don't, I'm not trying to catch anybody out, but because some people have tried to catch you out, because you've sometimes had labelling stating Prosecco Rosé. And certainly that's not legal. And so part of my job as well is to make sure that people aren't doing anything like that. And I've had a couple of occasions where we've had to pull people up on that. I was away on holiday once and I saw Prosecco Rosé on a wine list. And I thought, that is not correct. And the guy had been, he'd been told to put that on the list, but we don't have Prosecco Rosé yet. I'm hopeful for 2020, and in terms of our harvest in September, that this year we will be able to produce some Prosecco Rosé. We have experimented with producing Prosecco Rosé, and we've had some great results. What we did, the difference is going to be with Prosecco Rosé, you're still going to have your 85% Glera, but with Pinot Noir, which is going to give you the colour. Remember what I was talking about skin contact earlier on? When you're doing that pressing, what you're going to do is, because of the dark skin of the Pinot Noir, gently press, just pull off some of that colour. And we're going to be allowed to use up to 15%. Now, we did some experiments where we looked at Prosecco Rosé with, say, 6% Pinot Noir, the rest Glera, 10%, and on from that up to 15%. Clearly, if you use a less than 10%, you don't get the colour right. And also importantly, folks, you know what it's like. I love rosé. We love rosé all year round. When you're smelling a rosé, you expect it to smell like a rosé, don't you? And it didn't really have those aromatic notes to indicate that it was a real rosé. So when it comes into play, Prosecco Rosé will have to be 10% or more. That's what's going to actually have to happen there, up to 15%. I can see most of the producers actually certainly being around 12% plus, really. The other thing is, I talked about the second fermentation. It will follow exactly the same fermentation process as we had a couple of slides ago. But I talked about the minimum for Astoria, for example, with 30 days on the lees. The minimum for Prosecco Rosé will be 60 days on the lees. So we're going to have more lees contact there as well. And I can see some producers in the way we've had with some of the other wines I've talked about tonight having longer contact than that. We have a lot of Pinot Nero planted. I think I've tasted, we've done little parcels with a number of different producers, different styles of producers. I first tasted some of those Prosecco Rosé examples at Taste of London last year, which has typically been a big show for us, and I will be back there in 2021 for sure. And I was really impressed, with the depth of flavour, and I think it's going to make it easier for everybody to see that Prosecco Rosé is on a list, and it's right, and it's legal, and everything is good there. I think a lot of people are going to be attracted to Prosecco Rosé because it's interesting to remember a lot of these producers have been producing sparkling rosé from the northeast of Italy, but obviously can't put Prosecco on the label. So there's huge potential. And Pinot Nero, Pinot Noir, even for still wines, folks, has been an important grape variety in the northeast of Italy. So the fruit is there. Obviously, the main piece will be with the Glera wines that are pretty much 100% Glera. Some of the other examples, like I talked about, but Prosecco Rosé is going to have a very important role to play. And I think it's great. And I think it's going to be really good for food pairing. One other piece as well, you see on that slide, 0 to 12 grams of brut. We've been keen to get this extra brut piece in play as well, where we'll have Prosecco from 0 to 6 grams of sugar. As I said earlier on, that's going to mean there are some really dry Proseccos. If you took champagne, for example, we have 0 dosage champagne. And we certainly have some very dry champagnes. And some people out there really want to drink that dry stuff too, and I think there's going to be some quite good aging potential for some of those as well. I did taste a while back a Prosecco that was 6 or 7 years old, and it was a food wine. It was not a wine to have an aperitivo. I wouldn't have started this tasting at 6 o'clock with that wine because it had changed into something really big flavors. But none of that sort of citrus character. It was definitely something with food. So it's going to be about, I think we're going to see some more lees aging, more organic, more of that certification. And I think Prosecco Rosé is going to do really well. And we're going to continue to grow in terms of different markets as well. The UK, as a sort of final piece, Julia, the UK is the biggest market in the world for Prosecco. So thank you very much to everybody in the UK. I'd also add for everybody in the States, and here you can see this slide here. By the way, just to give you an idea that, if you look there, if you have a model where 75% of what you're producing is exported, a lot of people would be very envious of that model, really. But you'll notice the UK, yes, we had growth way back in 2011, 2012, like 150%, but we were still growing. Now that growth is single figure percentage, but it's still growing. Prosecco is so incredibly popular. I still feel, as I said later on, there are more places that should be listing more Proseccos. That's for sure for me, and listing brut extra dry, and when we have the Prosecco Rosés coming through as well. The USA, lots of people on from the USA. Thank you so much. The USA is growing like crazy. And thank you for all your support there. We do a lot of activity in the States, so really appreciate that. And what a great country. And Germany has always been very successful. Then those clearly are the three main markets. France is, I just had some stats through this morning, actually, just looking at the latest growth numbers from the 2019. And France is really growing very well with Prosecco. But I want to mention there's loads of other countries as well that are really engaged in Belgium, for example. I also also need to mention Asia. Asia is becoming a very important market for Prosecco, and so Australia. Although Australia still produces a Prosecco, much as we're discussing with that from a point of view of saying we're allowed to produce Prosecco, but Prosecco is getting very popular in Australia. So you are going to see the landscape changing in terms of new markets coming into play as well. I think Asia has got fantastic potential. Japan, countries like that, Hong Kong is very, very engaged with Prosecco. So it looks very good for the future. I just want to say something else which is really important too, and then I am going to wrap up because I've realised that, I've probably gone 15 minutes over here, folks. It's about time to, I don't know, you want to eat, I think, or have another glass of Prosecco. That's a better idea. I'm going to, but I just want to say, we've got wonderful places like Venice, Treviso, in Prosecco land, but also to say some of those other areas of Prosecco where Prosecco is produced, the rise of Prosecco has been absolutely fantastic for the economy. And also it's been great in terms of charity work that's been set up because of what Prosecco has brought into the Italian economy in the Northeast. And I'm not just saying that as a light word, folks. Gosh, at the moment we know the importance of charity, but also it has done a lot for a lot of different areas of the economy in that part of Italy. And some areas aren't so affluent as Venice, for example. So it's been important in some of the other regions that we've been able to offer support there as well, which is really important. So thank you very much to the Is there anything else, Julia, or do you think we ought to, everyone else to go and have another glass, I think?
There's been a few questions. I'm going to suggest that if we haven't got around to your question, people email me and I can relay them to you, Neil, if that's all right, and we can just distribute some answers. Question there about where to get your hands on some Cartizze in the UK, if you've got any ideas. Where to buy Cartizze?
Cartizze, you could go actually to North South Wines, for example. Company I mentioned earlier on, in actual fact, because they've got the Villa Sandy Cartizze, for example. In some of the other specialists as well, you would actually sort of see, I would actually look at a company like Slurt Wines as well, would be a good company to go for. But actually have a look at North South Wines. They are very big on the whole organic piece as well. That's certainly a company to have a look at. And I would also look at people like, there's a couple of the Italian specialists out there as well. In actual fact, you may even find in terms of Armit wines, I mentioned Armit earlier on with the Bianca Vigna, I'd be surprised if they don't have a Cartizze on their list, for example. So there are, although, as I said, there's 1 in 400 bottles sold in the UK is from Cartizze, people are keen to list them because it is a really wonderful special occasion. Have we got any other quick questions?
I think that's probably questions, but I think all the messages coming through are that they've really enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed it as always. It's just fascinating how much and your passion for Prosecco that comes through. As I mentioned earlier to everyone, we have recorded this, so if you do want to get the recording, my email address is in your confirmation, so feel free to get in touch. I'll send that over tomorrow. You can see all the socials there for both WSET and for Prosecco DOC. If you fancy putting a little post out, we'd all appreciate that. And I'll just mention also that we've got our quiz coming up on Thursday this week, if you want a bit of a drinks quiz, and more events next week, so don't miss out on any of those. But also just say thanks so much to Neil. As always, it's been amazing. And I'm sure you'll be back in person as soon as the school doors are open again, so that we can all try those lovely Proseccos with you this time, rather than just watch you drink them.
Yeah, thanks very much, Julia. Yeah, I know I felt very self-indulgent, but I just want to say just very quickly, thank you very much for everybody coming on from all the different parts of the globe. Thank you very much to the WSET. It's been great for us to have the opportunity to do this as a virtual tasting. Thanks to all the producers as well. But also, what I will post out as well afterwards, Julia, just a shot of some of the little posts. If you can follow me at the Wine Tipster, I'll tag in the WSET, of course, on Prosecco DOC, so you can just see a close-up of those bottles as well. They've been featured too in the tasting, so you can look out for those. And I just want to say a big cheers to everybody. Stay safe, stay home, and let's keep doing some virtual tastings as well. Cheers, everybody. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Cheers.
All right, I'm going to end the recording.